Welcome to Ex Parte with Aundrae Allison. I'm your host, Aundrae Allison. This show places you inside the first-person reality of ex parte family court proceedings, where one parent can make a one-sided emergency request to a judge for custody, protection, and relocation before the accused parent even knows that the hearing is taking place. The ex parte order is definitely the go-to choice for parents who know how to play the system. These parents are fully aware of its built-in incentives. And the incentives within the ex parte order, when it's misused like this, it just tends to bypass the requirements of a normal standard custody hearing. Now, by launching this one-sided legal strike, the petitioner, the parent, they secure an ultra high percentage of gaining primary child custody by default. Then once you tack on the reality of zero consequences for making false statements and zero penalties for flat out lying under oath, you can easily see why the ex parte order is prime for exploitation. Now, this series was just based on real world events that happened in my life. I went from a normal dad having two handsome boys actively present in their day-to-day life on a daily basis to, next thing you know, turning into a nationwide criminal with a governor's warrant issued against me, and then having to serve 44 days in jail without a bond. And all of this stemmed from a initial filing of ex parte in the month of September, which then led to a simultaneous ex parte order being filed and awarded against me within 7 days of that first filing. And the gap between those days of separation between parent and child went from 7 to 19 to 68 to 266 days in total, with just probably 8 times of just communication between my children and me. Now, the main focus of the whole podcast is just to have a voice for the kids who are just truly traumatized in all of this. And also for the voiceless parents who are dealing with this type of abuse within the court system. So not coming from the vantage point of being a victim, but more the voice for the voiceless. Innocent children are being pretty much held captive and also totally manipulated and used as a pawn. And they suffer the most because in the course is trying to protect doing the right thing, they just turn a blind eye to the emotional abuse of how a parent could totally manipulate the ex parte order and cause so much trauma to kids. That's just something that's not really looked at. And I wanted to create this podcast and a platform just to have that conversation and to make the public aware of this, especially parents. You can easily go from, a day-to-day parent to no longer having any access to your kids, and then just state intervention coming in and totally wiping you out the equation. So this podcast brings you first person experience from the eyes of the parent on the receiving end. And this series challenges the core assumption of family law. It dismantles the belief that every court decision automatically serves the best interest of the child. Instead, we are revealing the disturbing contradiction of how a single one-sided court request can instantly, totally reshape a child's life. Now, once the ex parte order is signed by a judge, it goes into effect immediately and enforces mandatory severance to the parent-child relationship, like I talked about. And, the court then completely avoids that urgency that is needed to restore that connection between the child and the absent parent. The ex parte order applies very questionable exceptions to normal court procedures, which leads to fundamental parental rights being stripped all before the parent or the party can even speak or defend themselves. And in doing so, the court unknowingly becomes an accomplice, a state-sanctioned partner in the manipulating parents' game. And that game is a game of revenge. Now, this series demands you to look at the system and ask yourself, when did the best interest of the child become a legal loophole? A loophole that allows a parent to weaponize a lie, totally disappear across state lines, and legally erase a parent overnight. Now, each series, we will start just with the basic definition of what the ex parte order is, because it's a very unfamiliar term and tactic that is used. It is one of those hidden anomalies, and luckily for most people, they never have heard of or never experienced it. And I'm truly happy for that, because once you're on the receiving end of it and you're ambushed by this, it takes a toll on your life, and it definitely destroys your relationship and your companionship with your children. So a basic definition of the ex parte order is this. Ex parte in Latin term meaning quite literally from one party. An ex parte order is a legal directive that is issued by a judge at the sole request of one party without giving any prior notice to or receiving any input from the opposing party. And the ex parte orders are these, emergency requests that are granted when there's true imminent dangers like abduction or abuse. However, it can easily be weaponized, and a lot of critics argue this. And it also can lead to due process violations and very unfair shifts in initial custody determinations. And more importantly, it severs the parent-child relationship before defense can even be presented to the courts. Now, The foundational truth that we will anchor here within this first episode is this. First and foremost, the parent-child relationship is one of the most important developmental bonds in a human life. And it is not an accessory, and it's not something to just be glanced or overlooked. It's literally a biological necessity. This bond single-handedly shapes a child's emotional regulation, identity, and their security. It dictates their confidence, their resilience, and their future social development. Now, following this human reality, let's look at how the law protects that unique bond. Under American constitutional law, parents have a fundamental right under the 14th Amendment due process clause to direct the care, custody, education, and upbringing of their children. The state has a right to act to protect children from real imminent harm, but undoubtedly, the state should never interfere with the parent-child relationship without due process, without ironclad evidence, and without meaningful judicial restraint. And the public is totally unaware of how this ex parte order can be so easily misused and weaponized, and how often it really is weaponized within the court structure. And for that reason alone, that was another reason behind the Ex Parte podcast, is to bring awareness to this legal mechanism or legal instrument within the family court. It is easy to misuse. Now, in addition to these legal protections, here's a terrifying blind spot that exists in our society. Most parents, they are completely unaware of how fragile their constitutional rights actually are. They have no idea that their parent-child bond can be suddenly or violently severed by a state-sanctioned legal decision made completely without them present. And they do not know that they can be legally erased long before a single accusation of real abuse is ever proven with verified evidence. Now, conversely, in emergency custody proceedings, the court's protective instinct is completely inverted. One side can walk into a courthouse off the street and they reach the judge first. They are then allowed to unleash the full force of the law before the truth ever enters the room. Each ex parte structure is really simple from start to finish. They just simply go in, they file an emergency request, they claim immediate danger, abuse, instability, neglect, or risk to the children. And because the allegations are presented as urgent, a judge reviews the filing quickly, often within hours, and without, again, notifying the other parent or allowing them to respond. And, once the ex parte order is awarded, next thing you know, the law enforcement treats the other parent like a criminal, and the parent who initiated the claim, they are granted temporary custody and also protection, and they are allowed to have several other requests within the filing. Now, again, when you consider the simple, dangerous mechanics of how this plays out in real life, think about it. One parent files an emergency request. The other parent is kept completely in the dark, and the judge reviews only one side of the story. The accused parent cannot respond. They cannot present any evidence, and the judge signs off on that order, and the order becomes totally enforceable that same day. And next thing you know, like I said, law enforcement is dispatched. Now, you will get a later hearing, possibly 7 to 10 days, but by that time, the forced separation has already begun. Now, the profound damage that is done to the child once the ex parte order is awarded, it totally just breaks the child's companionship with the parent, and it separates the entire family within a day. Now, indeed, this is one of the biggest catastrophic failures of the family court system. You have a forced state-sanctioned separation between a parent and a child. You see that it is an execution of rights first and a trial second. And then when you tack on the scientifically proven psychological consequences of this ex parte order, it shows how the damage that we're talking about is supported by research and evidence. For example, decades of research that examines forced parental separation have consistently shown a devastating truth. And that truth is, abrupt disruption of a parent-child relationship produces severe emotional and developmental effects. Now, studies in child development and attachment theory repeatedly associate prolonged parental absence with a terrifying list of consequences. And those consequences include increased anxiety, depression, emotional dysregulation, confusion, identity instability, and long-term behavioral difficulties. Now, let's dive deeper into the research. Research discussed in the Epidemic of Fatherlessness by James Albert Ellis Jr. at Liberty University identifies prolonged separation from a parent, particularly a father, is strongly associated with increased rates of mental health disorders, substance abuse, and academic failure. And this study, it tracks a straight line to incarceration, emotional instability, and suicide risk later in life. Now, when you think of the ex parte order, what you will find is it has a high threshold. And more importantly, because this the ex parte order is a form of custody that is transferred and it happens in complete secrecy, the law is statutorily designed to enforce this exceptionally high threshold before it is granted. Now, that threshold must require real verified proof, and the court must find an immediate, genuine physical emergency. The court must find that waiting for a standard hearing will likely cause irreparable harm to the child. Now, if that objective proof is missing, the law dictates the order should not be granted. Now, when the court lowers that high threshold standard, the court's instinct to err on the side of caution leads to an open door for a parent to easily weaponize the ex parte order. And what you will find is the ex parte order, again, like I said in the introduction, it is definitely a perfectly prime instrument for manipulating parents who have a hidden agenda. If you haven't seen a covert narcissist in a legal setting, it is truly a sight to behold. I mean, it's kind of funny to see how someone can have such a complete and total disregard for the law. Now, you see them openly lie on the oath and blatantly commit perjury and fabricate insane claims just to execute their smear campaign. And they have absolutely zero respect for the seriousness of the court. And here's the real punchline, though. At the early stages of the weaponization of the ex parte order, the courts really believed them. And with that being said, this shows you why the ex parte order is the ultimate tool for them to execute. Now you have a one-sided hearing. You have someone who has an agenda, and you have the ex parte order. When it's misused like this, the incentives that was referenced in the intro is very high reward and very low risk. When you step back and you just look at the structure of this ex parte, it clearly becomes very easy for you to understand why many professionals describe it as the weapon of choice in high conflict custody disputes. Reason being is it is the ultimate tool, again, for these type of people with this personality trait, because reality is the incentive structure is already built into the order itself. People with these behavior patterns, they know that courts would rather intervene quickly and sort the facts out later than risk failing to act in a situation that could potentially involve real danger. Now, that means that the perceived risk immediately becomes the powerful instrument that they use as leverage. And once someone has a clear understanding of that dynamic, the ex parte process itself can begin looking less like an emergency safeguard and more like this strategic opportunity to uproot a family, to bypass a normal court proceeding, or possibly get incentivized when it comes down to either custody or a divorce. Now, when you look at the initial ex parte stage, that the filing parent is not required to prove any of the allegations before any of the consequences actually occur. Now, going through this is very important to have a lot of information that you can utilize to your advantage to, heal through all of the process that you're going through. Now, my experience really was motivated by how an innocent child can be so easily ripped away from a loving parent before that parent has the opportunity to defend themselves. And it just led me down a rabbit hole of just countless hours of research on what it does to that parent-child relationship. So let's look at more of the research and evidence that shows how much damage the parental separation does whenever the ex parte order is signed and put into play. Now, the science says this about the damage done from the consequences of this ex parte order. The science says that the parent-child relationship is developmental, psychological, biological, and foundational. Decades of research prove that stable, unbroken parental relationships help children build emotional regulation, security, and long-term well-being. Now, you have Bowen's family systems theory developed by psychiatrist Dr. Murray Bowen. Dr. Murray Bowen explains that the family functions as an interconnected emotional system. Each member's emotional stability directly affects the function of everyone else within that unit. The theory emphasizes deep emotional interdependence, and parents and children, they continuously influence one another's thoughts, behaviors, stress responses, and sense of security. In this study, Dr. Bowens described families as living under the same emotional skin. So tension, anxiety, conflict, or disruption experienced by one member of the family spreads throughout the entire system and predictably alters the emotional function of others within that system. Now, within that framework, abruptly removing a parent from a child's daily life does not simply affect that isolated relationship, it completely destabilizes the emotional balance of the entire family system. Now, Dr. Bowen's research also explains that when anxiety and instability increase, emotional stress spreads through the interconnected relationships as well. Now, this leads children to experience confusion and security at a higher level, and they face withdrawal more and anxiety and depression or behavioral problems more as they desperately attempt to adapt to the disruption in their life. Now, the theory emphasizes that children rely heavily on consistency, stability, and predictable attachment relationships to survive, which is why sudden prolonged separation from a parent creates this long-term developmental and emotional scars extending far beyond the walls of any courtroom or any filing. Now, if you look at the mountain of science that we just established, this research is not a secret either. It's at the fingertips of us, readily available. And it's easily tracked and peer reviewed. Now, you're a parent on the other side of this thing. You're on the receiving end. You've been ambushed and you're paying attention to your kids. You're like, hey, this research is so readily available. Like it's exhaustively tracked and it's peer reviewed. How come it's not treated with the same urgency as physical abuse? Now, that was just research on the importance of parent-child separation and what it does. Here are the dangers, keyword dangers here, of all of this happening. When you disrupt that stability, you trigger this cascade of psychological trauma. And studies repeatedly associate prolonged parental absence with a devastating list of consequences. Those consequences include increased anxiety, clinical depression, emotional dysregulation, identity instability, and long-term behavioral difficulties. So a toddler does not experience separation as a temporary legal procedure. Clearly, the child experiences it as a sudden catastrophic loss to the very generic makeup of them being a person or them developing into a stable person. Psychological and psychiatric consensus explicitly proves that childhood emotional abuse causes the exact same neurological trauma as direct physical assault. Particularly, forced parental separation is dangerous because it is actively imposed by the state and it is backed by a judge's majestic signature. And it is enforced by armed police officers. It happens in the same day. It happens instantly without any explanation and again before any evidence is tested or proven to be substantiated. And it should be noted that this turns a temporary civil order into truly a traumatic lifetime developmental event. More data referenced by the America First Policy Institute reports that children from fatherless homes account for disproportionately high percentages of substance abuse, juvenile incarceration, and school dropouts. Now, conversely, longitudinal child development research links stable father involvement with improved emotional regulation and long-term psychological resilience. Now, when you're on the receiving end of this, you have a right to be a critic of it. However, not complaining, not being a victim, very solution oriented. And, I feel there are solutions that could be possibly applied. That's why the Ex Parte Reform Act will be pushed very aggressively. You have two options. You can complain about it, or you can try to find a way to, possibly improve the ex parte order and, discuss ways so it cannot be so easily, weaponized and misused in this sense to where so much harm gets done for the same children that the state is intending to protect. With that being said, my solution for this whole thing is the Ex Parte Reform Act. Now, the Ex Parte Reform Act takes a look at the darkness of this loophole that is being weaponized at the high level it is today. And of course, the act does not intend to eliminate the emergency custody protection because, again, real emergency do exist and children and women must be protected. Alternatively, in this first episode, the solution that we're going to address within the Ex Parte Reform Act is to require emergency custody power to meet a real, verified, high evidentiary threshold before the state is ever allowed to separate a child from a parent. The court in this case or in this provision must require a 48-hour evidentiary verification rule, and the court must legally weigh the psychological harm of sudden separation. The court must preserve a minimum parent-child contact floor that pretty much says unless, the verified evidence proves contact places the child in immediate physical danger, there's really no need to have the temporary order extend far beyond the period. Now, within the experiences I've had, There's only one or two choices. You can be someone who complains about everything, or you can share your story and possibly, find solutions or propose solutions and try to make a difference. And that's what I chose. So with the Ex Parte Reform Act, there are several provisions that we will go through each episode to address each topic within every episode about possible ways to improve this emergency mechanism that we have. And despite the darkness of this loophole, the solutions that are presented within the Ex Parte Reform Act do not eliminate the emergency custody protection at all. Actually, we are highly aware that real emergencies exist and women and children need to be protected. In this first episode, the solution that we are going to propose and discuss requires emergency custody power to meet a real high evidentiary threshold before the state is ever allowed to separate a child from a parent. In our provision that we're proposing, the court must require a 48-hour evidentiary verification rule. The court must legally weigh the severe psychological harm of sudden separation. The court must also preserve a minimum parent-child contact floor unless verified evidence proves contact places the child in immediate physical danger. And the court must enforce a strict 7-day parental severance hard cap, holding a full hearing quickly before a temporary order becomes permanent structural damage in a totally new location. Now, in closing, in this episode, we just briefly outline how the parent-child relationship is one of the most important developmental bonds in a human life, and it is a biological necessity. This bond single-handedly shapes a child's emotional regulation, their identity, their resilience, and their future social development. In this episode, we also address how the ex parte causes so much harm to this critical dynamic by blindly recognizing the importance of maintaining parent-child relationship. And once, of course, they lower that high threshold standard that is in place to award the ex parte, it opens itself up to be a loaded court order with massive incentives for these covert narcissist type of parents who have this huge hidden agenda. Now, sharing this information is how we raise awareness. This is how we educate the public and provide a voice for those who are impacted by this ex parte loophole. And as we continue to provide insight into the destructive ex parte order when it's weaponized like this and, totally misused in family custody cases, take a second right now and protect this platform. Please follow, like, and subscribe and share this content, please, because someone you know or may not know is fighting this exact invisible war right now, and they need to hear this. Plus, innocent children are being traumatized. And this is how we are able to defend those innocent children who are being traumatized and be the voice for them. So again, hit that like and subscribe button. This is Ex Parte with Aundrae Allison. See you next episode.